Tsavo River, early morning. The water moved quickly along the bend, full from the night's upstream rains. Along the far edge, where the current sharpened and deepened near the rocks, something broke the rhythm. A weak, uneven cry. It came again, smaller than a bird call, but just enough to pull Ranger Elim's attention from the worn trail he'd walked 100 times before. He stopped, waited, then heard it once more. No leaves moved, no animal darted. Just that thin, broken sound beneath the weight of water. He stepped off the path, boots sinking into the softened riverbank. His eyes scanned the base of the nearest rocks. For a moment, nothing. Then a shape, brown, slicked dark with water, no bigger than a curled fist. It didn't move when he stepped closer. Lodged between two flat stones, the tiny puppy lay still except for a single trembling hind leg. Half submerged and pinned by runoff, its back rose just above the surface, soaked through and shaking. Elim crouched low, one hand on the ground to steady himself. The current wasn't wide here, but it was fast. One wrong shift and the water would pull whatever it could take. He studied the way the pup's ribs lifted. Shallow, rapid. It hadn't been there long, or it wouldn't be breathing at all. A blood-tinged scrape ran along its side, the fur torn from dragging against stone. The rest of the body was limp. He didn't speak at first, just slid a cloth from his satchel, tied it around his wrist, then crept forward. The rock's edge cut sharp beneath his palm, but his hand kept moving. He reached just under the waterline, fingers brushing the pup's flank. No response. He shifted again, slipped his wrist through the narrow space beside the stones, and curled his hand under the soft chest. A faint shiver. Not a flinch, just the body registering contact. That was enough. "Easy," he murmured, barely above breath. With one pull, Elim lifted the pup free. The body sagged into his hands, warm where it had been shielded from the current, cold where it had not. The tail did not twitch. The eyes remained closed. But there was breath. Faint, fluttering, but real. He wrapped the pup in the cloth without hesitation and held him close to his chest, letting body heat replace what the river had taken. One drop of water slid from the pup's ear. Another followed from his fur, down Elim's forearm. The ranger stepped carefully back up the embankment, boots slipping once in the wet soil. Behind him, the river carried on without pause, swallowing the stones where the pup had been. If he had walked that path 10 minutes later, he would have heard nothing. If the current had risen an inch more, there would have been no one to lift. By the time Elim reached the ranger post, the pup had not moved. Not a sound, not a cry, only the shallow lift of ribs and the damp stain along the cloth. Elim laid him down gently on the old tarp near the supply shelf, wrapped a second cloth over him, and knelt beside the tiny frame. He placed one finger on the pup's side and felt the flutter again. Thin, erratic. If they waited, the cold could win. If they moved him too fast, the heart might stop. There was no middle answer. Elim lit a kettle, soaked a rag in warmth, and laid it over the pup's back. The chest rose once, held, then exhaled. He stayed there until the river sounds faded from memory and only the breath remained. Small, stubborn, alive. The river held its rhythm, steady and cold beneath a grayed sky. The rains upstream had returned in short bursts overnight, enough to deepen the current and glaze the stone edges with a sheen of danger. Elim stood a moment longer at the bend where the pup had been found, eyes tracing the line between the wet rock and the shifting water. It wasn't a place meant for rescue, but it was where he had to return. A slow path of prints marked his earlier steps, faded now beneath moisture and wind. In his left hand he carried a length of woven rope, not thick, but enough for one loop and a careful reach. The pup had survived the night, but barely. Its breath held steady in the warm cloth, though too shallow. And it had not yet lifted its own head. The scrape across its ribs had dried at the edges but still carried heat, and the limbs had remained curled, reflexive, and still. Elim knew the signs. Hours mattered, circulation, warmth, silence. But so did the place, the bend itself. If one had fallen there, another could have too. Dogs did not wander into rivers on their own unless something drove them. A sound, a chase, a herd, or fear. He crouched near the bend again, eyes skimming the far side where a thin outcrop reached into the water like a broken arm. Beneath it, shadows moved and gathered, not all stones. One shifted. A second whimper, lower than before, almost lost beneath the current. Elim turned his head slightly, waited, then heard it again. Not imagined. Not wind. Another pup. Further out, half tucked beneath the jutting ledge. There was no bank to cross from that side, no safe path to wade without losing footing. Elim anchored the rope around a tree root near the edge, tugged it twice, then lowered himself slowly, feet angled wide against the mossed slope. The cold met his boots first, then the legs of his trousers, then his hips. He gripped the line and leaned into the current with measured steps, never releasing the ledge with his eyes. The second pup was smaller, lighter fur, but the same thin ribs, the same dirt-crusted limbs. It did not cry when he drew near, just looked unmoving, one eye half shut from grit. Elim reached with his free hand, slow, palm down. No words this time. The pup blinked. One ear twitched. He slid the cloth from his belt and lifted the pup in, folding it into the fabric without tightening. The body slumped, but did not resist. Another inch of water might have closed its lungs. He turned back. The current pressed harder now, its pull clearer with the added weight. His foot slipped once on the stone bed, drawing a rush of cold up his spine. He steadied, gripped the rope, took each step back with breath held tight and knees locked. One misstep here would mean both pups would be lost. The line dug into his wrist. He kept moving. On the bank, he placed the bundle down beside the first pup, whose ear had flicked faintly at the nearby whimper. Neither moved toward the other, but both turned slightly, scent catching something unseen. Elim wiped the mud from his hands, pressed his palm against each chest. One faster, one uneven, but both present. If he hadn't gone back, the second would have been silent by evening. If the rains came harder, the ledge would disappear. There would have been no sound to follow, no shape to see. He wrapped them both together in a larger cloth and held them still against his knees. Beneath him, the river whispered on, its pace unchanged. But the bank had given two back. The wind shifted. The trees leaned slightly. In the distance, a flock lifted and turned above the canopy, circling once before drifting east. Elim moved through the tall grass with both pups bundled close against his chest, their combined weight slight, their bodies still soaked and trembling. The sun remained low behind the clouds, and the earth beneath his steps gave easily, softened by recent rain and the weight of the nearby river. When he reached a clearing just beyond the outer camp line, he knelt down and laid the bundle in the driest patch he could find, close to the reeds where the wind stayed calm. He peeled back the damp cloth gently, checking each pup in turn, eyes narrowed with quiet focus. The second one, the smaller of the two, still had a strong pulse, though the paws were cold. But the first pup, the one he'd pulled from between the rocks, was drifting too far. The breath had slowed. Not gone, but dangerously thin, like the wind before the heat. A faint red line of blood had reopened near the ribs, seeping into the grass below in slow pulses. Flies circled low, catching the scent. Elim waved them off and reached into his field pack, pulling free a soft cotton bandage and a water flask. He soaked the fabric, wrapped it around the wound without tightening too hard, and gently wiped away the mud that clung to the pup's eyes and snout. The limbs remained limp, the fur stuck in uneven clumps to the skin. He needed heat, not just cover, but warmth from another source. Cold could shut the body down faster than blood loss. He unbuttoned his jacket, wrapped both pups inside it, and held them close against his chest, skin to skin. They barely moved. He didn't speak, just kept his breath steady and low, letting it pass through them like a rhythm they could follow. Behind him, the wind stirred a ripple through the long grass, but the air near the ground remained warm. Minutes passed. A tremor ran through the first pup's back leg. It wasn't strength, just a flicker of muscle remembering what it meant to resist. Elim shifted him higher, pressing the chest gently to his own. If the breath slowed more, the organs would begin to shut down. If the temperature didn't rise, the pup would lose the energy needed to recover. If they moved too soon, it could break what little ground they'd gained. He glanced toward the field station in the distance but didn't call for help. It wouldn't reach in time. Here, the choice was stillness. The second pup moved first. A soft, involuntary sound came from its throat. Not a cry, not a bark, just air struggling through. It turned slightly toward the other body beneath the jacket. Elim placed one hand between them, letting them feel each other's warmth through his palm. The blood from the first pup's wound had slowed, clotting faintly beneath the gauze. The chest still moved, but only just. His eyes remained closed. The fur along his ears had begun to dry. A single drop of sweat ran down Elim's neck. He didn't move to wipe it. The jacket grew heavier with their weight and the dampness inside it. But his arms did not loosen. He leaned back slightly, letting his body become the anchor point they needed, giving all of his own warmth into theirs. A soft exhale, slow and low, left the first pup's lungs. Then another. What was at risk hadn't changed. If they pushed him to stand, he could collapse. If they walked him to shelter, he might bleed again. But if they waited just a little longer, there was still breath. There was still heat. He kept still, watching for another twitch in the paw, another rise in the chest. The grass around them lay flat in a wide circle, heavy from the hours of pressing wind. Just beyond the line of trees, a heron stepped through shallow reeds, its wings tucked and quiet. Elim did not look up. His hands stayed where they were, holding two lives that had nearly slipped away in silence. Elim moved slowly through the path back toward the main station, the damp cloth bundled tight against his chest, holding the small warmth of two lives caught between ours. The jacket was soaked through, but the weight in his arms remained steady. Neither pup made a sound. Their breaths were shallow but present. As the trees thinned and the first rusted edge of the ranger station came into view, Elim didn't pause. The sun had started its quiet rise behind the clouds, casting no warmth, just pale light across the yard where old crates leaned into the wind and the air smelled of last week's rain. Inside the small outpost, the floor creaked beneath his steps. He laid the pups together on a folded canvas beside the stove, where the heat was dry and still. A kettle sat idle nearby. He filled it with water from the tin pail, lit the flame, and waited for the steam. The second pup stirred once, a faint movement of a paw, but the first, the one found earliest, remained still. The bandage at his side had stained darker. His ears didn't lift. His breath came slower now, tighter, as if the ribs could no longer hold their rhythm. No call had come through for missing dogs. No radio message. No tracks leading to a den. Elim had checked again before returning. Nothing in the earth but the deep overlapping prints of bushbuck and spurred tortoise, not even a trail of human shoes near the river bend. Just a drop, a slip, a separation no one had seen. A litter, maybe, scattered in the dark before sunrise. If there had been others, the water had taken them already. He dried the pups with soft cloth, layering them in dry wrap and placing them close against a warmed bottle. The second one, smaller and lighter in color, nestled into the heat instinctively, front legs curled and nose tucked. The first stayed limp, eyelids sunken and fur brittle from cold. Elim touched his head gently, letting the silence stretch. Still alive, but barely. A fever had set in by mid-morning. The pup's nose had turned dry, his breath shallower. His body shivered once, then went quiet again. Elim crushed 2 tablets of veterinary antibiotic into powder and mixed it into boiled water, dripped 1 drop at a time into the side of the jaw. Most of it dribbled back out. He tried again. This time, the throat flexed once, swallowing on instinct. It wasn't enough, not yet, but it meant something. The body hadn't quit. Not fully. Elim leaned back and sat beside the canvas, boots outstretched, hands resting loosely on his knees. No movement, no barking, just the soft whistle of heat from the old stove. He watched the second pup breathe, slow and even now, its chest lifted in rhythm with the warmth, ears twitching at faint sounds in the wind. The first one had not opened his eyes since the river. There was no way to know if he ever would. He waited until the sun climbed higher, then stood and reached for the notebook on the shelf. He opened it to the last page, where names were kept for animals found alive but unidentified. He paused, glanced down once more at the motionless pup, and wrote a single word. Tamu. It meant quiet. Not silent, just still, just small. If the fever broke, the body might recover. If it didn't, the lungs would tighten until nothing passed through. There was no middle. No mother would return to claim him. No trail would lead them back to a den. Only Tamu. Only now. Outside the station, the wind pushed lightly through the trees, rattling the old tin signage. Elim closed the notebook. He poured another spoonful of warmth into the pup's mouth and waited again, watching for a swallow that took longer to come. 3 days passed with barely a change in the rhythm of the land. The rains eased, the river slowed, the heat returned. Inside the field station, the air stayed thick with quiet, broken only by the soft shuffle of Elim's steps and the occasional low breath from the stove. Tamu had not yet stood, but the fever had crested and dropped. He drank from the bottle now, in slow pulls, and slept without tremors. His chest moved steadily beneath the blanket, and though his eyes remained closed most hours, there were moments when the ear would twitch toward sound. A rustle, a footstep, a door. On the 4th morning, Elim returned to the river bend. Not for a search, not for duty, just to listen. The water was calmer now, clear in places where it had once been clouded by mud. The rocks that had trapped the pups were visible again, bare and slick, but the wind carried something strange. A broken note in the reeds, not loud, not insistent, just there. He stopped walking. The sound repeated. He moved upstream, careful with each step, eyes brushing across the tufts of grass rising thick where the floodwaters had pulled back. The call came again. Not sharp like a bird, but rounder, softer, tucked low into the earth. A whine. He crouched near a patch of knotted reeds and parted them gently with one hand. Beneath the thick blades, curled into a hollow, was a third pup, smaller than either of the others, thinner. The fur along its back had matted into the soil, and the ribs showed in long, shallow dips beneath the skin. Its eyes opened halfway, enough to catch light but not enough to focus. It did not lift its head. Its breath was quick, fluttering at the edges. There was a dark scab along the neck, dried and cracked from time and dirt. Elim didn't reach in right away. He stayed low, let the pup smell him, let the air settle. Then, slow and calm, he slid both hands underneath and lifted the tiny body to his chest. There was no resistance, no cry, but the breathing held. Back at the station, Tamu was awake. When Elim stepped into the room, the pup stirred. It wasn't much, a lift of the head, the ears flicking once, the nose pulling toward the open air. He hadn't done that before. Elim knelt beside the canvas, unwrapped the new pup, and laid her down just beside him. Her sides pulsed fast and uneven, but the warmth began to settle her. Tamu's eyes stayed on her, steady and fixed. She moved once, just enough for her nose to brush his front paw. Neither barked, neither whined, but they lay still, pressed edge to edge until their chests began to rise together. If she'd been left another day, the cold would have closed her lungs. If he hadn't followed the sound, her body would have dried into the earth before anyone found it. If the two hadn't touched, she might not have stayed breathing through the night. But she did. Elim changed her bandage, cleaned the scab, and gave her 2 drops of water. Then he sat back and watched. The silence thick with heat and breath, and the soft rustle of fur against canvas. Outside, the breeze had returned, moving through the dry grass like a memory. Beyond the trees, the river bent quiet again, and the sound it carried was no longer alone. By dusk, the second pup's fever had risen. Her body twitched in her sleep, not from cold, but from something deeper. A fight her weight could not support. The gauze around her neck had dried stiff, and each breath came with a soft catch at the top, as though her lungs were unsure how to draw again. Elim kept the kettle warm on the stove and the room dim, using only the last reach of the sun to measure the evening. Tamu lay beside her, quieter than usual, but awake. He no longer flinched at sound. He only watched her. The vet arrived late. She moved with practiced quiet, speaking only when needed. Her hands were clean, her words brief. She checked vitals, felt the joints, lifted the eyelids with soft fingers. No injections, no needles. The weight was too little. She mixed a warming broth with nutrient concentrate, then leaned close to Elim, voice low. One may not see morning. That was all. She left the bottle and stepped out, knowing there was nothing more she could offer in that moment. Elim didn't answer. He dipped a cotton swab into the broth and pressed it lightly against the younger pup's lips. The first drop rolled down her chin. The second she swallowed, weak and slow. Tamu shifted beside her, his nose brushing gently against her ear. That was the only movement either of them made for hours. The room stayed warm, but the air inside it changed. The silence was heavier now. Not tense, but still. As if the walls themselves understood the edge that had arrived. Elim stayed seated on the floor, his back against the far wall, legs stretched near the canvas where they lay. He fed them both in turns, a few drops, then rest. He wiped the corners of their mouths, shifted their legs, checked the wounds. Each time the small one exhaled, it came with a pause, like the body was unsure whether to keep trying. If the fever rose another degree, the organs would begin to fail. If the broth stopped passing, the energy would drain faster than it could be replaced. If she let go in her sleep, Elim might not even know until the next light. But she didn't. Not yet. Tamu began to stir again near midnight. It wasn't play, not a sign of strength, just restlessness, the body fighting through the stiffness that had built from stillness. He shifted once, then twice, until he was angled more toward her, paws brushing against her side. She responded with the faintest motion. Not a twitch, but a lean. Toward him, not away. Not accidental. Her breath was shallow, but it stayed. Elim leaned forward and pulled the second cloth tighter around them both, locking in as much warmth as the stove allowed. He refilled the dropper and gave them one more pass, alternating between the two mouths, careful not to overfill. One swallow, another. The rest he left to time. He didn't sleep, just sat still, blinking slowly, adjusting his posture every hour to stay awake. His back ached, his legs numb, but he didn't move from that patch of floor. There were no guarantees. The smaller one's pulse was thin, her ribs still pressed outward from hunger, but her ears flicked once when Tamu shifted again. And her head, just slightly, lifted from the blanket. By first light the fever had not broken, but it had not worsened either. The broth was gone. The cloths were damp with their breath, and in the stillness between waking and dawn, both pups lay pressed into each other. Not strong, not safe, but present. The wind outside caught the edge of a shutter and nudged it gently, as if to signal the day had returned. Inside, nothing moved but breath. Small, persistent, shared. The morning air carried the scent of warmed earth and dry bark. It had been 7 days since the second pup was found. The fever had broken, not all at once, but in the steady uncoiling of hours where breath became fuller and limbs no longer twitched without purpose. Elim had not moved them far from the canvas in the corner of the station, only enough to clean their bedding and open the small window above. For days, their bodies had leaned into each other, too weak for movement, but unwilling to separate. By now, both pups could lift their heads without help. The smaller one, named Mosey by the vet who returned midweek, had begun to mouth at the blanket's edge, testing her teeth in slow, unsure nibbles. Her weight had crept up gram by gram, enough to chart but not enough to call safe. Tamu, the first, moved differently. His limbs held more strength now, his posture straighter. He no longer shook when standing. Still cautious, still thin, but stronger. That morning, just after the sun cleared the trees, Elim opened the side door and laid a path of cloth from the interior out into the grass. Neither pup reacted at first. Then Tamu rose. Not fast, not without effort. He planted each paw down one at a time, tested his balance, and began to walk. It wasn't smooth. His steps dragged at the back. But he walked. Mosey watched, head tilted slightly, eyes blinking against the light. Elim waited without speaking. Tamu reached the edge of the clearing and paused, scenting the wind. Then Mosey followed. Her movement was less sure, body tilted to one side as though unsure how the earth would respond. She tripped once, caught herself with her chest, then stood again, letting her weight lean forward until her paws moved. Together, they made their way toward the low stream near the station's boundary, a small finger of water that bent from the main river and gathered in a shallow basin lined with reeds. The water here was still, no current strong enough to take. The surface shimmered in patches of early light, insects hovering just above. Tamu stepped to the edge, looked down, and did not flinch. His ears stayed neutral, tail low. He reached forward and touched the surface with his paw. No panic, no fear, just touch. Mosey stood beside him, leaning into his side. She did not touch the water, but she watched it, unblinking. If their legs gave out, the cold would return. If the ground shifted beneath them, the old fear might come back. But nothing shifted. The water remained quiet. The sky above did not move. Tamu lowered his head and drank. One slow lap, then two. Mosey inched closer, sniffed once, then lay down at the edge, her body stretched long against the grass. It wasn't strength yet, not entirely, but it was no longer collapse. Elim stood in the shade nearby, arms crossed loosely. He didn't call them. He didn't step in. They had walked on their own. What was at risk had already passed its worst. Their legs would tire and the hunger would still rise too fast, but the river had not taken them. The fear had not held. A breeze moved through the tall reeds, bending them softly toward the water. The surface rippled outward in slow circles, touching the edge of the pup's reflection, then settling. In the stillness, two bodies sat quiet and alive, side by side, where the current could not reach. The mornings had grown warmer with the season's turn, and the station no longer needed the stove to cut through cold. The canvas bedding had been cleared away days ago, replaced with open space near the eastern wall where the sun fell in soft lines across the floor. Tamu and Mosey had learned to rise on their own now. No coaxing, no cloth wraps. When light touched the edge of the room, they stood and waited, tails low but steady, eyes fixed on the doorway that marked Elim's step. He hadn't meant to name the second one. The vet had written Mosey in her notes, the one born after. It had stayed, like so many other things that hadn't been planned. Elim had never kept a rescue longer than the recovery window. He was trained to stabilize, to release, to let go. But the bush had its own rhythms, and some arrivals didn't leave on command. Each morning, he walked the same line out toward the northern boundary, checking fences and scan points, marking fresh spoor and noting migration shifts. And each morning, two brown shapes waited just beyond the shed wall. Not barking, not eager, just still, eyes following his boots as he moved, paws pressed lightly into the dust, never crowding. Never straying too far behind. They did not need to follow, but they did. Elim didn't encourage it. He didn't call them by name or whistle for company. Yet by the time he reached the first rise above the basin, they would be there, a few paces back, moving in slow, loping rhythm with the land. Tamu walked with a slight curve to his spine, the memory of injury still shaping his stride. Mosi kept low, ears forward, body quiet except for the brief moments when a breeze carried something unfamiliar and her nose lifted. They didn't chase or play. They stayed close to his line of scent, anchoring their pace to his. If one wandered too far, Elim would stop, not speak, not turn. They'd return. If he paused, they paused. If he sat, they curled into the grass nearby, eyes half-lidded, muscles loose. They moved with him the way they had once moved with each other, shoulder to shoulder, never urgent, never absent. The river they'd come from was still there, just beyond the clearing. Neither approached it. There had been an offer, once, from a sanctuary inland. 2 spots open, ready transport, good land, vetted caretakers. Elim had signed the papers. Then he'd set them down and not pick them back up. A few days passed, then a week. The envelope stayed where it was, edges curling from humidity. There had been no decision, only quiet. And still, they stayed. Nothing bound them to the station, no leash, no wall. The bush was open. Wild dogs roamed through in dry season. Hyenas passed at night. But these two never strayed past the edge of Elim's last footprint. When he returned to the gate at evening, they waited. Never first to greet, never last to watch. Just there, like shadows softened by dusk. If they stayed through the next rains, they might stay for good. If they wandered too far and didn't return, he would not follow. But they had not gone. They had watched the river, survived its hold, and chosen stillness in its absence. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the line of acacia trees, Elim stepped from the station porch and turned toward the path. Dust lifted with each footfall, catching light. Behind him, 2 bodies rose from the grass, stretched, and fell into pace. There was no sound but the wind through the scrub and the soft rhythm of paws pressing gently into earth.